I never thought my life would end up like this. When I met Marcus at my sister Emma's college graduation party 3 years ago, everything seemed to fall perfectly into place. He was reluctant to even be there. Typical Marcus. Always preferring quiet nights at home over social events. But Emma had dragged him along because she needed help setting up tables. I noticed him immediately, not because he was the loudest guy in the room or trying to impress anyone, but because he had this steady, reliable presence that just drew me in. While other guys were showing off or getting drunk, Marcus was quietly helping wherever needed, making sure Emma's event went smoothly. He had his life together, a good job, his own place, actual savings in the bank, the kind of man who could provide real stability. Emma caught me watching him and pulled me aside with this serious look. "Don't you dare mess this up with her. Josh," she said, using his middle name like she always did when she meant business. "She's a good one." I laughed it off. But inside I was already planning our future. Marcus represented everything I wanted: security, respectability, someone who would take care of me the way I deserved. Our first year together was like a fairy tale. Marcus was everything I'd hoped for and more. He took me to nice restaurants, remembered little things I mentioned wanting, and never made me split bills or worry about money. He was saving for a house, planning for our future in this methodical way that made me feel so secure. When he proposed after 11 months, I knew I'd found my person. The wedding planning phase was where I really got to shine. I'd been dreaming of my perfect wedding since I was little, and I wasn't about to settle for some courthouse ceremony or backyard barbecue. Marcus kept suggesting we keep things simple, maybe save the money for our future home. But I knew he was just being practical. Every woman deserves her dream wedding, and I'd waited 26 years for mine. The venue, the dress, the flowers, the band, everything had to be absolutely perfect. This was going to be the most important day of my life, and I wanted everyone to see how much Marcus loved me. He eventually came around and agreed to the big production. $15,000 later, we had the wedding of my dreams. Everything was flawless, from my custom dress to the chocolate fountain at the reception. I felt like an absolute princess walking down that aisle. Seeing Marcus waiting for me in his perfectly tailored tux, this was it. My real life was finally beginning. That's actually when I first noticed Derek. He was the DJ's assistant, helping set up the sound equipment, and he kept catching my eye throughout the reception. There was something exciting about the way he looked at me, like he saw something special that maybe others missed. When he complimented my dress during a quiet moment, I felt this little thrill that I told myself was just wedding day excitement. But when he slipped me his number and said I seemed too interesting to be tied down so young, I kept it instead of throwing it away. The first few months of marriage were wonderful, but I started noticing things that bothered me. Our apartment was nice enough when we were dating, but now that I was a married woman, it felt temporary and embarrassing. When friends came over, I found myself making excuses for our basic furniture and small kitchen. This was supposed to be our real life, not some extended dating phase. I'd text Derek occasionally. Just friendly conversation about music and life. He was in a band and had all these stories about traveling and meeting interesting people. Talking to him reminded me that there was a whole exciting world out there beyond our quiet apartment routine. Marcus would come home from work. We'd eat dinner, watch TV, and go to bed. Rinse and repeat. It wasn't that he was a bad husband. He was attentive and loving, but everything felt so predictable and small. Derek made me feel alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. When he invited me to coffee to hear about his latest gig, I told myself it was just friendship. When coffee turned into lunch, then dinner, then long drives where we'd talk for hours, I convinced myself I wasn't really doing anything wrong. I was just maintaining a friendship with someone who understood my creative side. The physical affair started about 6 months after our wedding. Derek had this tiny studio apartment that felt like a bohemian paradise compared to our suburban normalcy. Being there with him felt like I was finally living the passionate, artistic life I was meant for instead of playing house with someone who thought excitement meant trying a new restaurant. I justified everything by telling myself that Marcus and I had settled into roommate territory anyway. He was so focused on his savings goals and 5-year plans that he barely seemed to notice me anymore. When I'd hint about wanting to go somewhere fun or do something spontaneous, he'd suggest we save the money for our future house instead. Always the future. Never right now. Derek lived in the moment, made me feel beautiful and interesting and alive. After our first anniversary came and went with Marcus presenting me a detailed spreadsheet of our house hunting budget, I started getting seriously frustrated with our situation. I didn't think I'd still be living in an apartment after being married a year. I told him one evening, looking around our cramped living room, I thought we'd have a house by now. like actual married people. Marcus tried to explain about down payments and mortgage rates, but I could see Derek's studio in my mind. Small but full of personality and passion. At least Derek understood that life was for living, not just planning and saving for some theoretical future that might never come. My complaints weren't unreasonable. I'd given up my single life, my freedom, my options to be Marcus's wife. The least he could do was provide the lifestyle that was supposed to come with marriage. Instead, I was still living like a college student while he obsessed over retirement contributions and emergency funds. Meanwhile, Derek was writing songs about me, taking me to gallery openings, showing me what it felt like to be truly appreciated. The double life became surprisingly easy to maintain. Marcus trusted me completely and never questioned where I was or who I was with. I'd tell him I was having girls' night or staying late at work. Then spend hours with Derek exploring parts of the city I'd never seen. With Derek, I felt like the woman I was supposed to be. Spontaneous, passionate, interesting. With Marcus, I felt like I was slowly disappearing into suburban mediocrity. I started picking fights with Marcus about everything. The apartment, our social life, his boring friends, his predictable routine. Part of me hoped he'd fight back, show some passion, prove he cared enough to really engage with me, but he just listened patiently and try to problem solve, which somehow made everything worse. Derek would never be so passive about losing me. The worst part was how oblivious Marcus remained to my unhappiness. He'd come home with little surprises, my favorite takeout, tickets to movies I'd mentioned wanting to see, completely missing that I needed bigger changes, not small gestures. I was drowning in our ordinary life, and he was offering me band-aids. When I complained to Derek about Marcus's inability to understand what I needed, Derek would hold me and tell me I deserved so much more than settling for someone who couldn't match my energy. He was right. I was young and beautiful and full of life. Why should I resign myself to a boring marriage just because it was safe and stable? The guilt I expected to feel never really came. Instead, I felt more like myself than I had in months. Derek brought out sides of me that Marcus never even knew existed. With him, I was witty and adventurous and spontaneous. With Marcus, I was just a wife going through the motions of a life that felt too small for who I really was. I got careless after more than a year of successfully managing both relationships. Derek and I had been texting constantly, making plans, sharing inside jokes and photos. Our relationship had evolved into something that felt more real and meaningful than my marriage, which had become this obligation I fulfilled while living my actual life elsewhere. That Tuesday night in March, I was taking a shower when I heard Marcus moving around the bedroom. I'd left my phone on the nightstand like always, and not thinking twice about it, since he'd never shown any interest in checking up on me before. When I came out of the bathroom in my robe, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding my phone with this expression I'd never seen before. "Who's Derek?" he asked quietly. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to stay calm. "He's just a friend from work." "Why?" Marcus held up the phone so I could see Derek's latest message, which was definitely not work appropriate. There were weeks of conversations visible. Photos, plans to meet up, things that made the nature of our relationship impossible to deny. "This doesn't look like friendship, Madison." I tried to explain that Derek and I were just close friends, that Marcus was misunderstanding the context, that he was being paranoid and jealous over nothing. But he'd already seen too much, and my explanation sounded hollow even to me. "How long has this been going on?" His voice was so calm it was almost scary. "Nothing's going on. You're completely overreacting to some harmless flirting." Marcus stood up and started pulling clothes from his dresser, shoving them into a duffel bag. "I'm staying at my brother's tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." I followed him around the apartment, trying to get him to sit down and discuss this rationally. "You're seriously going to throw away our entire marriage over some text messages? This is exactly why I've been unhappy. You never want to actually talk through problems like adults." But he was already at the door with his bag. "I'll be back this weekend for more of my stuff. We'll need to figure out the lease situation." He left, and I spent the night calling and texting, trying to reach him. This was so typical Marcus, running away instead of fighting for our relationship. If he'd put half as much effort into making me happy as he was putting into this dramatic exit, we wouldn't be in this situation. I barely slept that night, expecting him to come home and apologize for overreacting. Instead, I got served with divorce papers at work 3 days later. Divorce papers. Over some text messages and hurt feelings. I couldn't believe he was willing to throw away everything we'd built over one mistake in judgment. The divorce process was a nightmare. Marcus refused to take my calls or meet in person to discuss reconciliation. Everything went through lawyers, cold and impersonal and final. I kept waiting for him to cool down and realize he was being ridiculous. But he seemed determined to blow up our entire life over this. Derek, meanwhile, completely disappeared when things got complicated. Suddenly his phone went straight to voicemail, and his promises about us being together once I was free turned into excuses about needing space and not wanting to complicate my situation. So I lost my marriage and my boyfriend in the same month, all because Marcus couldn't handle a little bump in our relationship like a mature adult. The divorce was finalized exactly 4 weeks after he moved out. 4 weeks to end a marriage that had taken 2 years to build. I kept expecting to feel relieved, but instead I felt completely lost. Marcus had been such a huge part of my life, and now there was just this empty space where our future used to be. I started showing up places where I knew he'd be, hoping to run into him naturally so we could have a real conversation. The grocery store where we used to shop together. The diner near his work where he grabbed lunch. The gym he'd mentioned joining. I wasn't stalking him. I just wanted a chance to explain that we could work through this if he'd stop being so stubborn. But every time I approached him, he'd turn and walk away without saying a word. Like I was some stranger instead of the woman he'd promised to love forever. It was cruel and unnecessary, especially when I was clearly trying to fix things between us. After a few months of getting nowhere with subtle approaches, I decided to show up at his family's annual barbecue. These people had been my family too, and I knew they'd want to see me regardless of what was happening between Marcus and me. Emma and I had been like sisters, and his parents had always treated me like their own daughter. I spent hours getting ready, choosing the perfect outfit that showed how well I was doing. Post-divorce, I'd lost weight, updated my wardrobe, and felt more confident than I had in years. When I walked into their backyard, I expected warm hugs and excited greetings from people who'd missed me. Instead, the entire party went silent. Everyone just stared at me like I'd crashed a funeral instead of a family barbecue I'd attended for 3 years running. Emma was the first to speak. "What the hell are you doing here? You're not welcome." I tried to explain that I just wanted to see everyone, that I missed them and hoped we could still be family, despite the divorce. But Emma's face was furious in a way I'd never seen before. "You don't get to cheat on my brother and then play victim," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You need to leave. Now." The humiliation was unbearable. All these people I'd considered family were looking at me like I was some kind of monster, instead of someone who'd made one mistake. I left as quickly as I could, but the damage was done. They'd chosen Marcus's side without even hearing mine. That's when I realized I needed to try harder to reach Marcus directly. I started sending letters to his apartment, then emails when he stopped picking up his mail. When he blocked my email addresses, I created new ones. I wasn't being crazy, I was being persistent about saving the most important relationship of my life. I tried reaching out through social media, but he'd blocked me everywhere. So I made new accounts, just trying to get through to him long enough to have one real conversation about our future. I knew if I could just talk to him face to face, without lawyers and family members interfering, we could work things out. The last time I went to his apartment, I discovered he'd moved without telling anyone where he was going. His neighbor mentioned he'd bought a house somewhere across town, which was ironic since that's exactly what I'd wanted us to do together. He'd achieved our dream, just without me. I eventually found his new address and drove by, just to see what kind of place he'd chosen. It was perfect, exactly the kind of house we'd talked about buying together. With a big front porch and mature trees in the yard. He'd gotten everything we'd planned for, but he was living there alone instead of sharing it with me, where I belonged. When I knocked on his door, he wouldn't even open it. Just spoke to me through the wood, like I was some kind of dangerous stranger. "Madison, you need to stop coming here. This has to end it." I tried to explain that I just wanted 5 minutes to talk about us, about the future we'd planned, about the mistakes we'd both made. But his voice was cold and final. "You had years of 5 minutes. You blew it. Don't come back here again." That's when I knew it was really over. Not because of the divorce papers or the lawyers or even the family barbecue disaster, but because of how completely done he sounded. Like I was just some annoying problem he needed to solve instead of the woman he'd once loved enough to marry. Now here I am, 2 years later, living alone in an apartment that's smaller and crappier than the one we shared as newlyweds. I'm exactly where I complained about being when we were married. Except now I don't have Marcus's steady income or his family or his future to look forward to. I have nothing but my own space and my own choices, which turns out to be a lot lonelier than I expected. Emma and Marcus reconciled their relationship a few months after the barbecue incident. I heard through mutual friends that they had some big heart-to-heart conversation where she apologized for initially pressuring him to be with me. Apparently, she'd realized she should have supported her brother from the beginning instead of getting caught in the middle of our drama. So now they're closer than ever, and I'm completely cut out of the family I thought would always be part of my life. Emma posts pictures from their family gatherings on social media, the same barbecues and holiday celebrations I used to attend, but with some new girlfriend Marcus has been seeing for the past year. She looks exactly like the kind of woman he should have married in the first place. Simple, wholesome, the type who probably thinks a perfect date is cooking dinner at home and watching Netflix. She fits into his boring, predictable life in a way I never could, and his family clearly adores her. I keep thinking about how different things could have been if Marcus had just fought for our marriage, instead of giving up so easily. If he'd been willing to work through our problems instead of running straight to divorce court. If his family had supported reconciliation instead of taking sides and shutting me out completely. But I guess some people aren't built for the kind of passionate, complicated love that real relationships require. Marcus wanted simple and easy, someone who'd be content with his modest dreams and quiet lifestyle. He couldn't handle being married to someone who needed more from life than just safety and stability. Derek never did call me back, by the way. Once the divorce drama started, he decided I was too much trouble and moved on to someone with less baggage. So much for all his talk about us being soulmates and how he couldn't wait for me to be free. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just been honest with Marcus from the beginning about feeling trapped in our small life. If I told him I needed more excitement, more spontaneity, more passion than our routine provided, maybe we could have worked something out, traveled more, taken some risks together. But I know the truth. Marcus was never going to be the kind of husband I really needed. He was comfortable and reliable and financially stable, but he couldn't give me the intensity and excitement I craved. I would have ended up feeling suffocated and resentful, no matter what compromises we made. The affair with Derek wasn't really about Derek at all. It was about feeling alive and desired and interesting again. It was about remembering that I was more than just someone's wife going through the motions of a predetermined life. Marcus never understood that part of me, the part that needed to feel special and chosen and fought for. Now I'm 30 years old, starting over completely, watching from the outside as Marcus builds the life we planned together with someone else. Someone who apparently doesn't need grand gestures or passionate declarations or anything more complicated than his steady, predictable love. Maybe that makes her the better choice for him. Maybe I was always too much, too demanding, too unwilling to settle for the quiet happiness he had to offer. Maybe some people are just meant for different kinds of love. And ours was doomed from the start because we wanted fundamentally different things. But I still think about that house he bought, with its perfect front porch and mature trees. I still wonder what it would have been like to build a real life there together, to grow into the people we were supposed to become instead of giving up on each other so easily. I guess I'll never know now. Marcus made his choice. His family made theirs. And I'm left with the consequences of decisions that seemed so justified at the time, but look completely different in hindsight. All I wanted was to feel truly alive and appreciated in my own marriage. Instead, I lost everything that mattered and ended up exactly where I started, alone in an apartment, planning a future that feels smaller and lonelier than anything I ever feared before.